Welcome to the 2019 Snider Lecture featuring Daniel Dale. Before we begin, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones or set it to silent. We also ask that you do not use flash photography during the talk. Tonight's lecture is being broadcasted live to a global audience. A link to the recording will be shared with all registrants next week. Now please sit back and enjoy the evening.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shelley Horachuk, and I am the chair of the Snider Committee and the chief librarian for UTM Library. It is with great pleasure that I welcome all of you to this year's Snider Lecture. This annual lecture, which officially started in 1974, so it's almost as old as this campus, was made possible through a bequest of the Snider family. They felt it was important to develop lectures that would bring campus speakers who enriched UTM's intellectual and cultural life, who made us think about the world around us, and whose words created conversation. This bequest has allowed us to bring in a diverse and fascinating group of speakers each year, and tonight is no exception. On behalf of the Snider Committee, I welcome all communities, both our community on campus and around the campus, to the 2019 Snider Lecture. Our guest lecturer this year is Daniel Dale. We are excited to have him with us tonight. I know that I speak for many of you here. I have been a fan for a while from the Toronto Star, and I'm really excited to hear what Daniel has to say tonight. Thank you for coming. Before we start, please allow me to take a few minutes to thank some people behind the scenes in the Snider Committee. When an event such as this takes place, it happens because of a lot of planning and hard work by some pretty amazing individuals, and I thank all of them. Particularly, I thank the Snider Committee members, some of them here tonight. It's always exciting when we get together and we decide, okay, who put in a pot, who do we want to bring out each year? And we have lots of conversation, and it's really exciting when we land on a person and we all say, this is our choice for the year. I also want to, though, thank three particular people who work very diligently behind the scenes. Mary Catherine Howard in the Office of the Dean, Sue Pryor and Melissa Hyde in the Advancement Office. As always, all of the work you do behind the scenes is essential to the success of our evening, and it's much appreciated. And there are also other members of our community that work with the Snider Committee to bring this all together. You'll see them around the room, you see them behind the scenes, and we thank them all. So what do I want to say tonight about our speaker, Daniel Dale? Well, if you don't know, you should. Since June of this year, he has become a reporter at CNN's fact-check team. Daniel previously spent 11 years as a reporter for the Toronto Star. From 2015 to 2019, he served as the Star's Washington bureau chief, and he developed an international following as the first journalist to fact-check every false statement from President Donald Trump, of which there are many. But he's more than just a fact checker. Daniel is a journalist. He also has covered the Trump's administration, Canadian-US relations, the 2016 and 18 campaigns, US campaigns, and breaking news and social issues across the US, including the mass shooting in Charleston and Dallas, riots in Baltimore, racial segregation in Milwaukee, and the opioid epidemic in Massachusetts. From 2010 to 2014, some of you will remember that Daniel broke major stories about Toronto's Mayor Rob Ford as the City Hall reporter and bureau chief. He's also an award winner. He won the Norman Webster Award for International Reporting at the 2019 National Newspaper Awards for his Trump coverage. He won the National Newspaper Award for Short Features in 2012 and the Edward Goff Penny Memorial Prize for Canada's Best Young Journalist in 2010 and 2011. He was named by Politico as one of the breakout media stars of the 2016 election and by Toronto Life as one of Toronto's 50 most influential people in 2017 and 18. That's a coup. A native of Thornhill, he is one of our own. We will not hold this against him, holds a Bachelor of Business Administration from York University's Schulich School of Business. Everyone, welcome Daniel Dale to the podium.
Thank you so much for being here. So one of the first times I used the word lying in print was after the mayor of Toronto chased me around a park, threatening to punch me, called the cops, and then strongly suggested that I was a pedophile. Do you recall this incident? This is, I've written a slideshow. This is the National Post's depiction. This is the National Post depiction of the incident. Not exactly right, but that's me with the hat. This was a formative experience for me as a journalist. Covering Rob Ford and covering the Fords as an entity was generally educational because you're on the City Hall beat, so you're covering debates about property taxes and transit, but you're also on the crime beat because he's smoking crack and hanging out with gun traffickers. You're on the high school sports beat because he spent many of his days in the daytime coaching the Don Bosco Eagles football team. So I was, as an urban affairs reporter, my byline was on high school sports stories. You were on the health beat because he was spending every Monday morning for a while weighing himself on a giant industrial scale outside his office. And you're on the weird family dynamics beat because, of course, there was a brother. My relationship with our premier has been unique and interesting. It's weird to know that the premier of the province of Ontario once stared at the back of my head in a hotel lobby for, in his own words, 5 to 10 minutes, and then called into a local radio station to brag about how he'd stared at me for 5 to 10 minutes. There's also, I wish, in the PowerPoint I tried to show, there's a picture of now Premier Ford hiding in an office plant on Halloween and telling people that he had gone as Daniel Dale, hiding in the bushes. So I wish. So it was educational covering the Fords. But the most educational thing, the number one thing it taught me, was how journalists should approach the issue of truth. And so I have 8 specific ideas about what we can do to put this idea of truth-centric coverage into practice. But before I get there, I want to take you through my journey, sort of mentally, how I got to these thoughts, and then my literal journey, how I got from here, from Thornhill and from the Toronto Star to being a guy who fact-checks the president at CNN, which I never expected to do. When I think about how I ended up here at CNN and with these thoughts, it all goes back to that Ford incident in the park. And specifically, it goes back to a column the Toronto Star let me write as I was trying to figure out how to deal with this. The column was headlined, "Rob Ford is lying about me, and it's vile." And after this all settled down, Rob Ford, after I initiated a lawsuit, he apologized to me, retracted the whole thing point by point. After this died down, I got to thinking, if I can use the word lie in a story about me, why can't I use it in all the other stories? Like, why should I get special treatment from myself or my own paper? Rob Ford, just as surely as he was lying about me, had been lying about his opponents, various policy matters. And so why do I have to dance around that objective truth? That's just objective truth. And so I stopped dancing around it. In the 2014 election, I invented something I call the campaign lie detector, where I would count how many, this sounds familiar if you follow my Trump coverage, I'd count how many false or inaccurate, dubious claims the candidates made. And I tallied them because I thought the number and the disparity was important in itself. And that disparity told the story. It was like Rob or Doug Ford makes 20, John Tory makes 2, Olivia Chow makes 2. Like that was the pattern. And so I did that, and I think it was like moderately appreciated. It was kind of low key. The Ford era ended. Well, I thought it ended. It ended for me personally, professionally. And then a month later, I went to Washington, and I was sure that it was going to be much more normal. Like I felt that, I got this once in a lifetime story at City Hall that was weird, that was amazing, but it's, now I get to do normal political coverage. And of course, Donald Trump comes along in June. So I was at his famous campaign launch at Trump Tower when he came down the golden escalator to Neil Young. I was there mostly because I thought it was going to be funny. Like, we didn't know if he was even going to announce. We thought it might be a PR stunt. Anyway, I was there. And I covered the campaign, and it was mostly delightful for a Canadian. Like, it's so interesting, such an interesting country. It's so amazing as a Canadian to be like, I followed Ted Cruz around towns in rural Iowa for a day. And I was like, it's like, where am I? Like, this is incredible. But even as I was enjoying myself, I became more and more disturbed by something I was noticing on the campaign trail. And that was that a whole bunch of Republican voters, like a very large percentage, seemed to strongly believe things that were not at all true. If you talk to scholars of conspiracy theories, as I have, they'll tell you that empirically, there's about the same level of conspiracy belief across the political spectrum. So I'm not saying it's only conservatives who hold conspiratorial beliefs. But on the campaign trail in the United States in 2016, there was no comparison. I would have pretty normal conversation with Democratic-leaning voters, and a lot of Republicans were telling me just wild stuff. I had person after person tell me that they thought that Hillary Clinton had, as First Lady, personally ordered the murder of dozens of people, like rolled them up in carpets and like buried them. Have you, there are documentaries about the Clinton body count. Yeah, I was hearing, the Vince Foster conspiracy, I was hearing this everywhere. I remember on that day in rural Iowa with Ted Cruz, I was in a library in a small town, and there was this one tiny, adorable woman who had invented this chant, like, Ted, he's our man. I'm like, okay, she's gonna be one of the people I interview after Cruz speaks. So I approached her, and very quickly, she turned the conversation to how, like, the New World Order and Barack Obama and the world government and Agenda 21 were, I don't even know. I basically tuned it out. It was distressing. And it was also distressing how much Donald Trump was lying to these people. What was happening was something that historians will tell you we had not seen on the campaign trail in the United States in a long time, if ever. And not only the frequency of the lying, but the triviality of the lying. One that stands out to me was in November, the last week of the campaign, when he started campaigning in Michigan, which he eventually won, he was telling people that he had once been named Michigan Man of the Year. And so I looked into this, some other reporters looked into this. There's no such thing as Michigan Man of the Year. But reporters were basically not telling people that this was happening. So what was happening was Trump would give a speech where he would make 10, 20, sometimes 25 false claims, and reporters would sometimes tweet about this. They'd sometimes fact check it on their own personal accounts. But if you were to read their story in the next day's paper or online or watch the nightly news or the cable news, you would not be told that one candidate said 25 false things. It would be like, Trump gives Clinton new crazy nickname, Trump unveils new policy proposal. I made a habit of checking the front pages of the local newspapers in the places where Trump had spoken, in speeches where he had made 25 false claims. And the headline was almost always like, Trump was here, people were excited. You see that one, this was during his presidency, but no punches pulled in a speech where he made 20 false claims. So, this was the tenor of the coverage. And of course, it's a story if you're a small town or a big town and the president comes or a candidate comes. But I thought the truth itself is also important. Yet it was being treated as a non-story or something to be relegated to full-time fact-check websites. Like, let PolitiFact deal with that, and we'll deal with the real news. To me, it was central. To me, truth is not a sideshow. It's the show. To me, it was like, okay, if you went to a car dealership and the dealer said 20 false things to you in an hour, or you went to a bar and you met some stranger who said 20 false things to you in an hour, that would probably be the first thing you told whoever about that encounter. So why wasn't it the first thing that we as journalists were telling our readers or viewers? And I wanted to do something to bring a specific focus to truth or the lack thereof. So one day in September 2016, I just made a list. This is the list of false and dubious things that Trump had done that day. And it got like a moderately good reception. I didn't have a ton of followers then. It got like 200 retweets. I'm like, okay, there's like some appetite for this. So I did it again. That one got 11,000. This was like maybe my second or third one. And that was a ton. It would still be a lot of retweets now. But I was like, wow, there's a real hankering for someone to give them this information. And then came another tweet that changed my life. Michael Moore, of all people, the filmmaker, tweeted, this Canadian journalist every single day, that's the operative part of this, in the Toronto Star, lists all the lies that Donald Trump spoke that day, shames the US media. And I got a ton of followers from that. And I was like, so, thank you. So I was very excited about my followers and Michael Moore noticing me, but I was like, oh my God, I have to do it every day. And that's when I started doing it. That's not a joke. That's actually how it happened. And so So I've done it every day since then, with the exception of Trump's transition period when I took a vacation, thankfully, and my own transition to CNN. And so now I'm 5 weeks behind because of that job switch, and I'm trying to catch up. It's hard. It's cool being at CNN, and it's surreal to me. Like, as a Canadian, I always thought I'd be a print reporter. It was amazing to me just to be at the, not just, but to be at the Toronto Star was like what I wanted to do. I never thought I'd be, on TV or in the US. And it's weird at times. Like, I share a little office with another reporter. And the other day, I heard someone advertising ice cream outside our door. Like, I get your ice cream. So I opened the door excitedly. It was like 3 p.m., afternoon snack time. And it was Wolf Blitzer pushing the ice cream cart. So Wolf Blitzer said I could tweet this. You don't want to get on Wolf's bad side. No, I've learned that Wolf Blitzer is an amazingly nice person. But anyway, so on the fact check team at CNN, there are 2 full-time reporters and a full-time reporter researcher. And even if I didn't work there, honestly, I would think that was awesome, because very few media outlets are treating fact-checking like a daily endeavor. And I think we need to, because we're in the middle of a full-blown truth crisis with Donald Trump, and it has to be addressed. I think we need to treat misinformation like a health virus. You can try to deal with it after misinformation spreads. You can sometimes have some success, but it's much better if you can interrupt the transmission, act aggressively at the outset to try to prevent the spread. And if you don't do that, it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And I know this firsthand because of my Ford incident. I don't know if any of you remember the hashtag I know it's 7 years ago, but there was a hashtag that was used the night of the Ford incident. Rob Ford had accused me of standing on cinder blocks to peer over his fence, which I never did. And so the hashtag was Fencegate. And so that's 7 years ago. I was very clear. I never looked over the fence. There was no fence component. Rob Ford invented this. So 7 years ago. What do my friends call this incident when we talk about it now? Fencegate. Because that was the narrative that stuck. That was the early framing of the story. That's what media repeated. And that's what was in people's heads. And it lasts for years. The backyard thing too, the other component of Rob Ford's false story was that I was caught trespassing in his backyard. I've never been in a Ford backyard except for Ford Fest, of course, the backyard party. But I was not in the backyard that night. And I have people all the time complimenting me, supporters of mine, being like, wow, you've come so far from Rob Ford's backyard. This was a congratulatory. And so it's like, yes, but no. You got to try to interrupt the transmission or else stuff is going to stick for a long time. So what does it mean to try to interrupt the transmission? I have eight thoughts about what a truth-centric model of political journalism means in practice. It means, number one, that no headline or tweet or anything should quote a politician saying something false without noting that it is false. Still, today, we're 4 years into the Trump era. He started running in 2015. He manages to get prominent news outlets to put his lies in their headlines and tweets without any correction. They're amplifying rather than challenging. That's just not our role. The second thing I think it means is that in every article, any TV news segment, false claims need to be challenged there as well. And sometimes reporters are like, well, I'm not going to say in my story, liar Justin Trudeau said today, liar Andrew Scheer said today. No, it doesn't. I'm not saying that. It just means that if you have to quote them saying something inaccurate, you should put in the facts right afterwards. It means, number three, not giving up after the first or second or third repetition of a dishonest talking point. I think liars like Trump rely on their ability to wear us into submission. They know that the media will often be like, well, we already fact-checked that a few months ago. We're not going to run the same story over and over. And in practice, what happens if the media fact-checks it the first time, second time, third time, and then Trump says it 100 times, as he literally, I've counted, he has said some of these things 100 times, then the other 97 times, I think he wins. He gets that information to people unfiltered. The fourth thing I think it means is challenging leaders directly for their lies. One of my eternal frustrations with interviews and media gaggles or scrums of Trump is that even as he's repeating lies he's told literally dozens of times before, he is almost never confronted to his face. And I just think it's an abdication of our duty as journalists. I think reporters, anchors need to come armed with facts and be prepared to use them. The fifth thing I think it means is doing fact-checking on days outside debate nights. fact-checking is often treated like, it's like a holiday. Oh, this is like fact-check day. It's like one of the 3 debate nights, and we're gonna actually provide you the facts behind what the leaders are saying. I know that media outlets are resource-starved right now. There's not a lot of money to go around, basically. People are getting laid off, bureaus are being closed, but I still think that more can be done to make this a regular part of coverage. The 6th thing I think it means is giving less airtime to politicians, aides, surrogates with a proven history of using that airtime to deceive people. This is disputed within CNN, of course, as well. This is my personal opinion. There are varying theories about how we should treat people like Kelly and Conway, for example. In my view, my personal view, I think it's best to avoid giving these people as much oxygen as we're giving them. And I also think it means doing less live airing of Trump speeches, or at least having a quick hook when he starts to lie. We need to provide the context. Our job isn't just to let liars lie unfiltered. The 7th thing I think it means is not striving for a false, quote unquote, balance. Now, I fact-check Democrats. I think we have to fact-check Democrats even as we're fact-checking Trump. But we don't have to do a 1-to-1 ratio of fact checks when there's like I don't know, I'm making up a number, but if it's like a 30-to-1 ratio of lies, there's a huge imbalance between Trump and his opponents. We don't have to pretend, we don't have to go 1-for-1, pretend that it's equal. And we have to be open and direct about the fact when some candidates are much more dishonest than others. And finally, I think doing a truth-centric model of political journalism means using the word lie, at least sometimes. We're in the accuracy business, and lie is sometimes the most accurate word. Like, I think my favorite example is in 2017, do you remember Trump gave this bizarrely political speech to the Boy Scout Jamboree? It was very weird, and he was challenged about this because he was criticized by some parents of these poor children. And he was like, no, I got a call from the head of the Boy Scouts. They said it was the greatest speech ever made to them, and they were very thankful. And so I contacted the Boy Scouts. They told me no one ever called him. No one ever said that. And so I was like, well, if anyone else in your life made up a phone call, you'd call that a lie. So why do we as journalists have to dance around that? That's a lie. People ask me sometimes why I've been relatively alone, not totally alone, but relatively in mainstream media in using that word. I don't exactly know, but I have some theories. I think most of it is institutional edicts. So reporters take the brunt of it. We are the face of the coverage. So people will say falsehood and get yelled at. It's often from the top. It's editors, it's publishers, chief executives, boards of directors, whatever, being like, that's not what we do. I think part of it is just that reporters, like everyone else, are used to their old habits, doing what they've always done. And I think some of it is frankly that it's just often easier to use the other word rather than get into a vocabulary debate in a big, complicated institution. And I've seen some of that creep into my own thoughts at CNN, honestly. Nobody has muzzled me. Nobody has told me don't use the word lie. I'm still using the word lie. They've been great. But sometimes it's like, well, like I've been here 2 weeks and I don't really know how things are done here. And I don't want to have to like get approval from 3 people. I want to get this article out quickly. I want to tweet this right now. So I'm going to call it a false claim just to be safe. And I think there's a lot of that kind of feeling of wanting not to go out on a limb in the vocabulary choices. So I am pushing for lie in a lot of cases at CNN, and my bosses, to my great happiness, have agreed that it's appropriate in a lot of cases. This is a tweet from last week. He said this again more recently. This lie he keeps telling about Veterans' Choice, a program that Obama signed into law. He keeps saying they couldn't get it for 45 years until I came along. So I've kind of become known as the lie guy in media. And I think that's cool. I think this debate is important. But I also think the vocabulary debate is secondary to the issue of whether news outlets are doing any correcting of the false claims at all. My big complaint is still not that news outlets won't say lie. It's that they won't point out to their readers and viewers in any way that politicians are deceiving them. We're at about 6,000 false claims from Donald Trump as president by my count. The Washington Post, their count, people ask me why the count is different. They have about 12,000, but they also count what they call misleading claims, some of which are not objectively untrue, so I omit them. Whatever the number is, it's just too many for media outlets to keep doing what they've always done. And frankly, it's not that hard for media to do more to promote truth. It can be tiring. I'm tired. And that's just because because of the sheer number of false claims, but it's also it can be deflating when Trump is seemingly impervious to the fact check. And so he never changes course. You were not going to correct his own behavior. When he says the same inaccurate figure for the trade deficit with China 125 times, it can get depressing. This is me in a moment of recent depression, but I'm not going to quit. I'm not going to retire from that. We can't give up. We have a lot of complicated systemic challenges in media these days. As I said, advertising dollars are falling, local papers, big papers, all papers are laying people off, coverage of city halls, provincial and state legislatures is shrinking, foreign bureaus are closing. I don't know how to solve any of these long-term problems, but we also have a problem of eroding trust. And I think that if we're going to have the public trust us, one of the things we can do is extremely easy, and that is being straight shooters with them. Tell them the real facts and tell them in a straightforward manner when their leaders are not being honest with them. That's not bias, that's objectivity, that's honesty. I often think that too much of the conversation about the decline in trust in media revolves around conservative criticism of media. We have to listen to what conservatives say, and I think often they have fair points. Sometimes I reject it. They have some valid complaints. But we also have to listen to, say, people of color who tell us that their stories and people who look like them are not being adequately represented at our publications or at our outlets. And we also have to listen to readers who are frustrated that we're not sufficiently fearlessly fulfilling our democratic role as fearless guardians of truth. Now, all this stuff seems pretty obvious to me, but what I've been doing, fact-checking, is not popular with a lot of people. Nothing I've ever done has so angered people as pointing out that what the president is saying is often not true. Polls suggest that Donald Trump has somewhere between a 10 and 20% approval rating in Canada. I think I've heard from all of that 14% or whatever. They've all emailed me. Here's one representative example. I will read this email. Have your parents applied for a retroactive abortion? My parents have you applied? My parents are in the audience. You were such an asshole. Trump may exaggerate, but if your only takeaway from the speech is just that, then you are truly left-wing nutbar. These emails are often missing words. However, since you went to York University, I would expect not less, some good local knowledge. I send from my iPad. I always love that. A lot of these emails, like a disproportionate number, are from iPads. I don't know what that says, but. So there's a lot of emails like that, and you just have to laugh it off. Sometimes you want to respond, never respond. If you ever have trolls, don't deal with them. But in addition to this kind of garbage, I also get a lot of good faith, skeptical questions about why I do what I do. And one of the questions I get boiled down to it is basically like, isn't this all useless or pointless? People will be like, I really appreciate it, but Donald Trump got elected. He still has like a 40% approval rating, tens of millions of people like him. Facts obviously don't matter in this era. Why are you losing any sleep over this? And I think that's too negative, too defeatist. I disagree that it's pointless, and I think I'm losing sleep for a reason. And here are the 4 things I say in response. The first is that it's important for journalists to stand up for facts regardless of how many voters want them. What is the job of a journalist in a democracy if not to provide accurate information to whoever wants it? Are we going to let the fact that one politician has a support base cause us to surrender to him and let him say whatever he wants without any correction? The second thing is that you don't need to reach a lot of people with facts to make a difference, especially in the United States. The last presidential election was decided by about 1% of the vote in 3 states, a very small number of voters. So I don't think we need to convince the hardest core partisans. We don't need to convince the entire population that we're correct to make a difference. If we can get important factual information to 5%, even 1%, you can make a difference. The third thing is that it's not actually our job to change elections as reporters, and whether an election was changed is not how you measure whether reporting is worthwhile. Like, what's the most famous example of effective investigative reporting in North America? It's Watergate, right? Woodward and Bernstein, All the President's Men, and so on. Something that a lot of people don't remember is that Richard Nixon won re-election in a landslide, despite a bunch of Watergate scoops being published before that. Not the full story, but a lot of them. So was that useless reporting that they shouldn't have done because Richard Nixon got elected. No, our job is to make the electorate more informed, not to change the outcome. And the fourth thing is that I think saying facts don't matter assigns too much significance to the views of Trump's base, which is, by all accounts, a minority of the country. Just as we shouldn't ignore these people, we shouldn't treat them as the only quote-unquote real Americans. Donald Trump lost the popular vote in the 2016 election. Donald Trump has been hovering around 40% approval, with disapproval well above 50. So if your view on whether facts matter or not goes by these metrics, I don't think they're good metrics, but if that's the metric, then there's a bigger constituency for facts than for not facts, or whatever you call it. And it's not just the election results. Every poll I've seen has shown that about 2/3 of the voting public thinks that Donald Trump is not honest or trustworthy versus about 1/3 that thinks he is. So it's not like Donald Trump is deceiving the whole country. There's sometimes this view of him as this master manipulator. Oh, he's getting away with all this. A lot of people know he's lying. A lot of people want facts. This is not only the only thing that I've done that has most angered people, generated the most hate mail. It's also the thing I've done that has most excited people. I get actual letters in the mail. People write letters thanking me for giving them hope. It's amazing. So let's think of those people too, and not the base alone. But the base is interesting. I know in Canada people ask me, like, who are these people? Why do they think what they think? I've learned, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on them, but I think I've learned a fair bit about them from my travels, my conversations. I've been to about a dozen Trump rallies now. They're very interesting. Trump supporters have generally been very nice to me, and I'm conscious of the fact that my colleagues who are black, who wear hijabs, who don't look like me, sometimes have a different experience. But for me, people have been fine. One thing I've learned is that the behavior of Trump supporters in groups can be very different than they are individually. And my best example of this was at a rally in Florida in the last 2 weeks of the election. I had a very pleasant conversation with a woman at the rally. And then I retreated to the so-called media pen. And during the rally, Trump did the thing where I don't know what he said, but about the fake news or whatever. And people like turned around and they booed us. And this woman who I just had this lovely conversation with was like, boo, boo. And so I looked at her, I was like, oh, we just had such a nice conversation. And she looked at me like it was kind of like, she didn't say anything, but it's kind of like, well, this is just like what we do here. So I think some of it is it's a kind of a group mentality, or there's a theatrical component. Something takes over people when they're at a rally that isn't necessarily how they are on a one-to-one basis. I went to 2 Trump-supporting communities in Ohio in 2017, and there's a kind of infamously cliched kind of Trump story by this point that people like to make fun of. I'm sure you've read like 10 of them, where it's like, we are here at like Sue's Diner, Jimmy's Diner, Stan's Diner, and we're with like the regulars, and they voted for Trump. Do you still like Donald Trump? And they're like, yes, we do. I think that kind of journalism has very limited utility at this point, but I went because I wanted to ask them a specific question. As someone who is spending all his time fact-checking Donald Trump, I wanted to know, how do people perceive his level of honesty? Like, do they know he's lying? Do they not think he's lying? If they know he's lying, how does that affect their perception of him? And I didn't expect one of the most frequent answers I got from these people. It was this. It was, so several people, it's not a scientific sample, it wasn't a poll, but they told me that they liked the lies because the lies were throwing the media, people like me and others, into a tizzy. These were direct quotes. My story was filled with these quotes. So I asked the owner of a clothing store about one particular Trump lie. I think it was the Barack Obama has wiretapped me in Trump Tower stuff. And he said, this is a quote, "I think Trump just did that to freak them out. They were giving him bad times, so he gave them bad times. Mess with their brains." He started laughing. Then he said, "I like that because we've had so much crap in Washington for years, and now we have someone shaking him up real good." And so if you're the Democrats, like, I don't know what you do with that kind of mindset. But that's not, so that I think it's important to think about these people, and I think about them a lot. But there are other groups of Trump supporters too. A lot of them tell me they do care about facts, they do want to know the truth. Some of them, though, say that Trump's policies are more important to them than his BS. So they're like, well, I know he makes up stories, but he puts conservative judges on the bench. He stands up for Israel. He cut my taxes. And to me as a reporter, like, that's rational. Like, that's fine. It's not my job to dissuade people from supporting Trump. And so I just want to, when I give these talks, I like to tell people it's not that they all have no idea that he's making stuff up. A lot of them do. Others say, though, that they do believe that he's honest, which can be hard to believe. But when you press them on their media habits, as I often do, you'll understand better. They'll tell you they don't trust the mainstream media. They'll spend their days, they watch Fox, they listen to Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, they read Breitbart, they're reading Facebook groups with like Patriot in the name. It's safe to say that none of these entities are fact-checking the president. And so no matter what people like me do, that information is not getting to them. In the short term, I honestly don't know. I don't know how to get good information to these people. I think pulling them away from propaganda will take some sort of sustained long-term effort to rebuild trust in fact-based, truth-based institutions. And I don't know how to succeed quickly at that, but I know we have to keep up the fight. I think there are a few things that you as individuals can do to contribute to a truth-based discourse. One, and this isn't an attempt to gin up clicks for myself, you can read and share fact checks. You can make sure that you've read an article before clicking retweet or share on Twitter and Facebook. Sometimes the tweet or the headline will be different from the body. You can limit your sharing to some trusted, verified sources. When I make mistakes, I get things wrong too. It's embarrassing as like the fat guy. It's often because I've been rushing in some way. I haven't double verified. And so before sharing information, even from your trusted sources, you can do your own quick research. Google, has this sensational news been corroborated by other sources? Is it being framed the same way by other sources? If you're on Twitter, there are experts around, often willing to answer questions from citizens. You can politely ask them something they love to answer. If you're on Facebook and a friend or family member is sharing stuff that isn't true, maybe if you can, reach out to them non-confrontationally or confrontationally, whatever works, and tell them that they're getting something wrong. It's not always pleasant or easy, but a lot of this is not pleasant or easy. Before we get to the Q&A, I'm excited to take your questions. I'll leave you with one story. This is a story that I used to use as my optimistic ending to opinion columns and speeches, and it's turned out a little bit more complicated than I'd hoped. I had the honor of writing a column for the Washington Post about fact-checking and Trump and lies when I was still at the Star, and I ended it with the optimistic story of a man named Bruce Brown. I interviewed Bruce during the Obamacare repeal debate of late 2017. He was a diehard Trump supporter in rural Pennsylvania. He watched Fox News, listened to Rush. He thought Hillary Clinton, he told me, should be shot or in prison. Hardcore Trump supporter, but he benefited from Obamacare, and he didn't want Trump to touch it. So I did a phone interview with him. It was fine. And then maybe a day later, he messaged me on Twitter, where I had found him, to tell me, I found your fact-checking. And I was like immediately apprehensive. I thought he was going to be like, you didn't tell me that you were also fake news, you deceived me. Instead, he was grateful. He said, this is a quote, wow, I kind of knew he wasn't truthful much of the time, but not to the degree of hundreds of lies in such a short period of time. Thank you for opening my eyes. And he concluded by saying, thanks again. I won't bother you anymore, but I'll be following your fact-checking of a man, as of today, I no longer can believe anything he says. I can't stand a liar. Take care. And so this was very encouraging to me. It showed me that if you establish a human connection with people, even people who are in a kind of media bubble, show them you're human, you're trying your best, you can convince them that you're providing them facts. And so I put this in my post column, I put this in other speeches, and people would clap and be excited. And then Bruce messaged me again. And he told me, I'm still behind Trump totally. I can't believe what's happening in the resistance movement of the left. I meant to message him back. I never got around to it. And then about a month and a half after his message, I was trying to, but Twitter wouldn't let me send Bruce a message. So it was like, did Bruce block me? But it turned out that I had blocked Bruce without knowing it was him because he had been in my public Twitter mentions spreading a conspiracy theory about Democrats committing mass voter fraud. So I had blocked Bruce. And so my quick happy ending story doesn't have a quick happy ending anymore. And I think it's an important reminder to be realistic about how much we can accomplish even with best practices. There are a whole lot of people out there, not all of them again, but a whole lot who are kind of gone to us for the time being. But I still take some hope from this. Progress isn't linear. But the fact that someone like him could even be temporarily persuaded by someone like me after we establish a connection made me feel at least a little more hopeful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So if anybody has any questions, we have a mic over there. And if you just want to come up and ask a question of Daniel, please do so. Just introduce yourself and any questions? Come on. Oh, we have, okay.
Oh, we have someone.
No, it's Dave. You make a point that everything that you say is predicated on all of us having the same definition of objective truth that you do. There are a lot of people, not just in the United States, but here in Canada, who would say, you do not know what objective truth is. There is a different definition of truth. And in fact, anybody can make up their own definition of truth. We see that pretty much everywhere today. So how are we as regular citizens who don't have a platform that you do, how are we to deal with those who will say, truth can be whatever you want it to be? Because it will ultimately go to the point where we will have school children getting a test back from the teacher, 12 out of 20. Go, no, that's not true. I got 18.
Right.
We will have people sending in resumes for jobs saying, this is my truth, and this is what I believe is truth. And truth really doesn't exist. So how do we as normal citizens deal with that?
It's really hard. I think there are valid criticisms of the idea of objectivity in journalism. Like, I think recently there's been people of color who have gained increasing prominence on Twitter arguing like objectivity is just code for maintaining the status quo. And so when you talk about unbiased journalism, that doesn't, when you talk about unbiased journalism, what you're talking about is upholding structures and systems that work for people who look like you and not me. And anyone who's going to point out, inequities in society that are real is going to be accused of being non-objective. What I try to do as a reporter to deal with that kind of sentiment, like I can't believe anything you say, we have our own, truth is whatever you say it is, I have my own different truth. I try to provide as much hard primary data and information to people as I can. I try to remove myself from the fact check equation, even though I'm the fact checker, as much as I can. And so I think some of the most effective things I do, and again, this is not empirically quantified, but my perception of what's most effective is when I can juxtapose Trump's words with a screenshot of the actual information and not even comment at all, provide a link to the actual information, be like, here's what he said, here's the truth. I think that's better than anything I can say to people. And so there are always going to be people who are like, well, even so, like if there's something like that on the unemployment rate, there are always going to be people who are like, I don't trust the unemployment rate. That's the deep state, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I can't believe them. Some people are unreachable, again, to people like me. But I think best practice for fact checking is assert as little as you can, show as much as you can. So if you can show but not tell, that's ideal. But again, some people are extremely difficult. Questions? This is my favorite part. Yeah.
Can you totally believe everything, most of what comes out of websites such as Snopes, in your view?
A gentleman asked, can you totally believe everything that comes out of websites such as Snopes? I think Snopes generally does a good job. I think on at least some occasions, they've been validly criticized by conservatives for being overly punitive toward some statements. I'm sure there's liberal criticism of them also. I've just more recently seen it from the pro-Trump side. I'd say that Snopes is generally reliable. I think it's a good source to go to. But I'd say any source, like even me, try to find a second source as well. So I'm a Snopes fan, but try to buttress what they're saying with other stuff as well. Yeah.
How much is the unreachability factor a result of the for-profit side of the business here, right? News didn't used to be for-profit. It was limited to a small group. We all had that same sort of thing we listened to, whether it was the 3 stations in the US or a couple here. Now, you choose your news, you choose your source, and it's for-profit driven. So your challenge of breaking through is limited by the fact that people are just choosing what they want to see and hear.
Yeah, I think the increasing existence of media fragmentation, the existence of bubbles, the ability of people on the right to entirely shun what have been known as mainstream news outlets, to not read any newspaper and rely solely on Fox, right-wing talk radio, and Breitbart. I think that's a huge problem in terms of reaching people with facts. And I think as we talk about impeachment now, I think it's a central difference between this era and the Nixon era is Trump has Fox. Nixon did not have that. Like, even if Nixon complained about media bias, conservatives in that era complained about media bias, but conservatives were also stuck with that media even as they railed against it. They were forced to consume this information, more or less, aside from maybe a magazine or two. Now, people are getting, to borrow Kellyanne's phrase, alternative facts, an alternative version of reality. So I think the Fox bubble is a huge factor in the inability of people like me to reach a lot of citizens.
Hi. How do you think artificial intelligence systems being able to generate deep fakes, such plausible video, like fake videos, like I think there's like one of Trump singing a Kanye West song. How do you think that's going to affect the fact-checking landscape going forward?
It's going to get worse. It's going to be difficult. I think we're thankfully at a stage now where the deepfakes are not very, very, very good or very prevalent. I think if and when, it's a when probably, these videos get very effective. I think for fact checkers, it's going to force us to slow down even more. There's a demand, especially at CNN, like every time Trump talks, it's like fact check it fast. And the reason that I can often fact check things fast is because Trump says the same things over and over. And so people are like, how do you do it? How do you live fact check? It's because this is the 100th time he said that thing. And so the first time I couldn't, but I've researched it now. Anyway, I think when video becomes less reliable as a primary source we can consult, when the video itself is deceiving us, I think we're going to have to do this slower and just be even more on guard. I think there's kind of a siege mentality. Like, people are out to trick us right now. They want us to screw up. They want to hoax us. They want us to fail. And you just can't. You can't let them get you. And so I think it's going to be hard, and I think we're going to have to go real slow when that happens.
Hi, my name is Karina. So my question to you is, you mentioned the notion of not having an idea of a balanced sort of fact-checking, or what we would think of a balanced debate, where you have, let's say you had a climate change scientist and then one climate change denier, and you think that that's a balanced debate.
Right.
And you approach that with journalism, which I thought was really interesting. But do you think that it's still important for us to fact-check many world leaders? Because Trump is a very colorful character, but how do we ensure that not at the US stage, where the US is evidently the most powerful country in the world, so how do we ensure that other countries are fact-checking their leaders as well? And how do we do that effectively? It's
a great question. Yeah, I mean, Trump fact-checking should not be limited to Trump. I think there's room to do much more of it in Canada. I think we've seen some of it in this federal election, but I think it goes back to my point, federal election is pretty short. It's 2 months-ish or out of the year. This should be a daily part of Ottawa coverage, of Queen's Park coverage, of City Hall coverage. There's been a proliferation of fact-check websites, fact-check initiatives all around the world. I gave a speech in California, a talk in California, and I met someone who was launching a fact-check initiative in India. There's people doing it in a bunch of African countries. I think this era has been, it's been bad for truth, good for truth infrastructure. I think when the next serial liar comes around, I think the media will be better equipped to handle it. And so in terms of how we encourage that, I hope that philanthropic organizations that are supporting media will make this a priority around the world. And there are a lot of countries where it could do a whole lot of good.
Hi, if you think back in history to when there was a flurry of fact-checking around McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, I'm wondering, you're providing a lot of primary source material. What do you think people will think of your tweets in 50 years?
I don't know. There's so many days with Trump where it's like where I think about that. Like, what is the tweet that he tweeted the other day with the hyphen that was really an apostrophe? Like, I literally I woke up and my tweet about that was like, I'm just staring at it. I was literally just like what are historians going to think of any of this? I have no idea. I don't do this for history. It's obviously for the here and now. But I hope that it will be a good source for anyone studying dishonesty and misinformation in this era. And I see it, not that I'm a historian, but sometimes I go back and, like, for speeches or just for my own information, I'll go back and try to remember something from my City Hall days. And tweets are an amazing record because, like, unlike articles, you have a timestamp when everything happened, and you have little details that often won't make it into articles. So I have no idea, but I hope that it's useful as a source.
Good evening. My name's John, and it has been said that the world needs more of Canada, but I would say we need more of you.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
So I really appreciate what you do because it is a very difficult task. And I was just wondering with respect to whether or not journalists have a code of conduct and whether or not it's acceptable for journalists to actually knowingly repeat lies. The second point is, if this is allowed to continue, is there a challenge potentially of the freedom of the press? Because from my perspective, it's too much freedom, and it could be run into very serious implications down the road.
And what do you think is too much freedom?
Well, the fact that if journalists are permitted to continue to repeat lies, and it's to your point, if you repeat a lie frequently, then it may become known as the truth. And the concern is that at the end of the day, I see journalists as trying to ensure that whoever the audience is that they're making informed decisions based on facts.
Okay. So I don't know of any universal code of conduct for journalists. There might be one, but I haven't seen it. Individual, at least major outlets, and I think smaller outlets as well, will usually have a book or list of employee standards. But I've never seen one that addresses the repetition of lies. And I think to the contrary, like, it's kind of the tradition has been kind of the opposite of a don't repeat a lie ethos. The tradition has been, look, we're just neutral observers. Our job, we quote what the candidate says, we quote what the other candidate says, or we quote what the prime minister says and the opposition critic says, and that's it. And that's what I've been trying to break people out of. My argument, as you've heard, is that is insufficient. I think it is. It is detrimental to the press in a lot of ways when we just repeat it. It erodes trust. It allows us to be used as a conduit for misinformation rather than as a stop on misinformation. And I think it will contribute to our continued financial decline. And so I think there are a lot of reasons to change the way we've traditionally operated. I've seen, though, that change has been very slow at a lot of entities.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and you mentioned that a lot of Trump supporters know that he's lying and they like his lies and they're almost following the uproar that he causes. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering what could be causing this need and desire for uproar in the public, and what would be a good way to approach this from, like, different standpoints, like a journalist standpoint or a politician's standpoint? How can we solve this in a more rational and truthful way than Trump is?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of different theories. I don't know which one I subscribe to. I think some of it, people mock the economic anxiety theory for Trump support. I think some of the feeling that we just need to blow it all up comes from the economic upheaval of the last 10, 20 years, recession, people losing their jobs. I think there's a theory that people are increasingly detached from social institutions like church, religious entity attendance is declining. People's participation in communal events are declining. They feel increasingly isolated. And then you have people who want to blow it up. Like, it's not just Trump supporters. You have a lot of Sanders, even Warren supporters who say this system as it exists is designed for oligarchs, for big corporations. We need to destroy it. And so I don't want to dismiss there are different reasons that people want to blow things up. Some of them are more rational than others. It's not my job to dismiss it. And I think that, there's also a racial component, at least there was in 2016 and with Trump. Like, a lot of people were unhappy with Barack Obama being president. They thought that he was serving people who didn't look like them or live like them. And they wanted to push back forcefully against that. How to fix that? Honestly, I wish I had a better answer. I don't know. Like, it's so complicated, and I don't know. I just don't know. I think there's an effort by even people like Andrew Yang, one of the candidates running now, to try to harness some of that anxiety in a more constructive way. And I think you see that from Sanders and Warren also. It's like, yes, we know you think it's broken. But let's not blow things up in a way that's going to harm other people. So you see different attempts. I don't know how to solve it myself.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jamshed, and I was just wondering why there's such a strict polarity between Democrats and Republicans. Because, for example, 1 year ago, Brett Kavanaugh was being, there was a big trial going on regarding his acceptance to be a new Supreme Court justice. But when the vote went to the Senate, all the Republicans voted, or most of the Republicans voted for him to be the, nominated to be the new Supreme Court justice. But most of the Democrats voted against him. So why is there such a strict polarity between Democrats and Republicans, and how can we fix this gap?
So it's another complicated one. Some of it is gerrymandering. It's the drawing of legislative districts to overwhelmingly include voters from one party, and so that affects House elections, not Senate elections. But in the House, that results in members having their only fear be a primary from their own party. Because if you represent a gerrymandered district, it's like, okay, I'm a Republican. And 80% of the voters in this district are Republicans. So a Democrat's not going to beat me. So I don't have to moderate my stances at all. What I do have to worry about is someone who's more conservative than me winning the support of these conservative voters. I fear my right. And so I think gerrymandering leads to people taking more extreme stances than they otherwise would. I think some of it is also, it's the Fox effect. Basically, the media landscape is such that people are becoming somewhere between polarized and radicalized. A lot of these representatives know that if they are perceived as soft, then the base is going to come after them. You've seen this with, for example, Jeff Flake, with Bob Corker, with Mark Sanford. People who have gone even minimally against Donald Trump they're gone. And so there are a lot of incentives for people to stick to their party lines. That goes for Democrats these days as well. Like, you have candidates, even Joe Biden. Like, Joe Biden is still leading or close in the polls, but when he has spoken of working with Republicans, there are a lot of people who have savaged him for that. The Democratic base, a lot of it is not in the mood to work with this party that they see as far right, as radical, as racist, and so on. And so I don't know if there's an exact equivalence. There probably isn't, but on both sides, there's an incentive to retreat into their corners. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carol. Amazing presentation.
Thank you.
As I can see from your presentation, Twitter has done a lot to help you with your career and help you get out your message. A couple days ago, we found out that Facebook was actually not taking off actual fake news from politicians. So my question to you is, why do you think that social media has been so slow to fact check and combat fake news, and what can we as consumers do about that?
I think, well, what they listen to is dollars, right? Is people leaving their platforms, not advertising on their platforms. I don't think it's my role to urge people, to boycott or to do anything. Just as an observation, it seems like that is what moves them. As for why they've been so slow, I think it's the old story. Like they just want to plod along, raking in cash, and they don't want to anger anyone. And so they know, like when Facebook announced its fact check initiative, there were a lot of conservatives yelling at Facebook, being like, this is going to be liberal bias. This is just this is like a backdoor way to censor our content. And you've had some of that. You've had criticism of these companies from the president himself. And so I think there's a lot of fear of angering tens of millions of people, and they don't want to do it. I think they are slowly but surely doing it as they face criticism from the other side that they also don't want to anger. But again, change is very slow.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Bryson. I find it funny that we're talking a lot about America right now, and there happens to be an election here.
Oh my God, an election.
And I'm just wondering, there was a lot of angst ahead of time that the misinformation was going to be a massive problem for this election. It kind of doesn't feel like it, unless I'm wrong. And tell me if you've been paying attention or not.
I've been paying moderate. I'm just like a voter in this election. It's kind of fun.
Why hasn't it played out like that up here?
I don't know. I really don't know. I have no answer, but it's great. I don't.
Can you learn from it?
I honestly people ask me Canada questions and they're good, but I feel like I've been there for 4 years. I just kind of to the extent I've been paying attention to Canadian politics, it's been NAFTA stuff, USMCA stuff, like covering the trade negotiation. But I don't feel like I'm informed enough to have good Canada opinions right now. So I'm gonna gently avoid your question because I don't know.
Okay, so let me ask then. There was a lot of moves to try and regulate social media, or a bunch of plans. Like we just heard that social media seems to be plodding along and not making any changes. Do the changes need to come in from up top or from top down? Is there rules or laws that need to be made?
I think I haven't thought too much about this. My instinct, and I might change my mind in a month or something. My instinct is that social media should do more in identifying information that is not true. I understand that it's difficult for them when it's a political campaign. You've seen, even in the last week, Democrats, the DNC has called for Facebook to either remove or identify, I think is remove a Trump ad going after Joe Biden, saying it's false, it's defamatory, whatever. And in fact checking that, I found it misleading, but I wouldn't call it false. It's not something that it's not something that I would remove as false. And so there's a lot of gray here and it's very difficult. But I think there are other cases where stuff is much more verifiably false. And I think at least, let's start with the egregious cases and identify things that have been definitively fact-checked by verified good fact-checkers. I think if we can, attach a pin to some of this stuff, still a lot of people are going to ignore it, but it might help some fraction of the population.
Hello, my name is Howard, and I was also a journalist back to my home country. So here's a situation I faced before. Let's say that there's a politician or authority make a claim. However, you think that the claim is questionable, but you don't have the access to the authority or the government because they hold those information.
Right.
And what would you do? And also because meanwhile that maybe other media has published those reports, you have the pressure from your audience, from other news, and also from your management.
Yeah.
How do you deal with those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I deal with a lot with Trump. The question of what do you do when you think he says something not true, but you can't prove it? The information is being closely held, or you just can't. It's just something that you can't get at. I have that a lot with Trump phone calls. He's constantly claiming that he had conversations that really sound like they didn't happen. A guy, I got this phone call from the head of a big company, or this big businessman. He said to me, it's that sounds untrue. Or there's stuff about his own actions, what the government is doing. In those cases, you're pretty helpless. But I think that if there's sufficient evidence for you to think it is dubious, it is likely to be untrue, I think you can add words like without providing evidence, or did not provide the data to support this claim. And so you may not be able to call it false or misleading, but I think there are ways to signal to readers that we don't know if this is correct. It's a problem though, it's hard.
Thank you.
I'm Rob, and I'm wondering if you have had any direct feedback from Trump or any of his crew.
No, so Trump, I've never spoken to Trump. His people, at the start, they almost totally ignored me. The one exception was I got this scoop about NAFTA, that he made these off-the-record comments to Bloomberg that I got, and so I had to contact the White House for comment, and they called me immediately, and they were like trying to make a deal, like, we'll give you this other stuff if you don't publish. I'm like, I don't even know, like, we don't know each other, like, we have no relationship. I'm not gonna, anyway. So the fact checks, an interesting thing about the Trump administration is that they do not engage with fact checkers. I think because they know it's a lost cause. Like the aides, they know that he lies a lot. He lies to them, like they know. And so dealing with the Democratic campaigns, it's not pleasant. If you tell them, like, I'm at CNN, I'm making a request for comment, I'm planning to call this claim misleading or false, like you will get like a phone call that's likely to be very unhappy, challenging your conclusion, maybe challenging your credibility. The Trump people do not engage. One thing that was interesting to me was that I did a fact check of Kamala Harris. What was it? I forget. It was she made a false claim about Trump, and Trump, or more likely his aides, posted it on his official, like, the Donald Trump Facebook page. It was like, wow, look at this fact check from CNN. And so it was very surreal to me. Trump went after CNN fact checking today. I was supposed to be on a day off. But he, in a speech in the Villages, this retirement community in Florida, he was complaining that CNN had allegedly fact checked one of his jokes and called it false, which is not what happened. So the only feedback I've gotten, I don't know if he was talking about me, but it was literally today.
Okay, thank you. My name is Michael. Just had a question in regards to, you kind of touched on this earlier, but in terms of the kind of fact checking you do, it's more checking kind of something that you can objectively verify, kind of black and white facts. So if, for example, someone says the unemployment rate is 40% and it's really 8%, then that's an obvious lie. I just want to hear your thoughts on kind of fuzzier areas where the lie, or if you consider it to be a lie, it's less obvious. For example, you're not saying that the unemployment rate is 40 or 8, you're saying the economy is doing well.
Right.
And that's kind of a very open-ended concept. And if you run a show, for example, and you bring 10 people in who say the economy is doing well, that in a sense is a lie because you're presenting one side of the story.
That's another great question. I confront that a lot with Trump because he makes a lot of claims that, like, I might not personally think are true, but I don't think are objectively false. And there's that word again. You mentioned the economy is doing well. Trump often says we have the hottest economy in the world. So, like, what is hotness? Like what is that? Like, or he'll be like, our economy has never done better. And some fact checkers I've seen have been like, that's false. You know, GDP growth is like 2.whatever%. It grew at 4.5% in this quarter in the Obama era. And I'm like, well, like, but he didn't make a claim about the GDP number. It was a more general claim. I don't think we should call it false. And so I have a couple of approaches. One is like, for my list of false claims, I ignore a lot of this stuff because I think one of the things that can undermine the credibility of fact checkers and make us look very silly is like trying to definitively fact check something that's not a definitive statement. People are like, what? Like, I think the Washington Post fact checker got in trouble with certain quarters for trying to fact check a claim about how many people make a living wage. It's like, well, what is a living wage? And so I wouldn't call it false. But I do think that there are ways to address these claims by presenting the fact check differently. So you don't have to call it false. You don't have to call it misleading. You can be like, fact checking Trump's claim that the US has the world's hottest economy. And you can give people the facts. Okay, like here's the growth rate. Here are the jobs numbers. Here's what the World Bank says. Here's what the IMF says. And so what I've encouraged other journalists to do is like, you don't always have to worry, although the vocabulary is important, you don't always have to call it a lie. You don't always have to call it a false claim. You don't have to give it any label. You can do a service to readers in your news story or a separate article by just providing the context. And so in an article, you know, if Trump says we have the hottest economy, insert a line like, here's the growth right now, here's what it was before, here's how it's doing in other countries. And so I think there are ways that we can get more facts into the discourse on fuzzier claims without having to give them a label.
I'm wondering if you think there's too much of a preoccupation with Trump and that there should be more coverage of some of the activities of his administration, like deregulating environmental regulations, and Trump seems to suck up all the air in the room, and there's all kinds of other things that don't get the coverage.
Yeah, I do think so. I think that's something I've thought from the start. You know, and it's like, I don't think I'm hypocritical in saying it, because I think someone needs to do the close reads of his words and focus on his words and fact check them. But I think that the media writ large, I think we can be so fixated on Trump's crazy stuff that we miss substantive stuff that he is not talking about, but that is happening, and that is very real. So I completely agree. And it's funny because the example I cite whenever I talk about this is environmental deregulation. I think it's some of the most important stuff that's getting little covered. The New York Times has done great coverage of it. There are entities that have done great coverage of it, but there are tons of deregulatory actions and other important things that the administration has done that Trump will never mention, or mention only vaguely, and that most people won't hear about because we're covering the latest, you know, outlandish, outrageous Trump thing.
Thank you.
I'm going to be a downer and say these are the last 4 questions, or we'll be here all night.
My name's Laura. Daniel, thank you for sharing your insights
Thank
this
you.
evening. My question is, do you think if Americans are ready for a female president in 2024?
I don't know. It's in 2016. I've never made like actual predictions about elections because I've been a reporter. But I think that the problem with some of my late campaign coverage, not the fact checking, but when I was like writing articles for the Star, was I think implicitly, I think some of the articles conveyed too much confidence that Clinton was going to win, that Trump was toast. Like when the Access Hollywood, you know, the tape came out, he was down like 10 points, and I would amend some of the articles. So one of my resolutions coming out of the election was no more predictions, either explicit or implicit. So I don't know what Americans are ready for. I'd remind people that Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than Trump, so clearly tens of millions of Americans are ready. Whether it's enough to win the next election, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Hi, Daniel. I'm Steve. I want to first thank you for the work that you've done in the last few years. It's been very helpful for us to try to understand what in fact is happening in many places. I want to speak to you a bit about the notion of the evolution of the word truth. When I was a child, I watched something called Superman, and it always began with, he was for truth, justice, and the American way. It seems over my lifetime, which is a lot more than most people here, that the notion of truth has evolved. And we find it in all circles, whether it be media, advertising on TV, or politicians, or people trying to sell you goods and services. It seems to have eroded from the truth that I knew and the one that Superman was talking about in 1953. So I'd like you to kind of comment on the evolution of truth, and I'd like you to comment in a context of America versus Canada, because you're a Canadian working in America, focusing on American things, and we are not the same, despite what I think the media tries to tell us. We are a different place, we have different traditions, but I'd like you to comment a little bit about the evolution of truth in America and Canada.
The question's a challenge for me, because I don't feel extremely well versed in some of the history of the ways that people have thought of and approached truth over the past decades. I can say that I think some of the evolution is probably constructive. there's a move, at least among some of the population, toward talking about my truth and our truth and how we all have different truths. And there are valid criticisms of that as well, but I think it gets to something important, which is that often our coverage that is purported to be objective has left a lot of people out, has left stories out, has left voices out. And so I don't think people decry, not that you're doing this, but people say, we used to have one truth and now everyone has their own truth. I think, well, people always kind of had their own truth, but maybe you just weren't listening to those truths back then. Maybe we should all kind of hear some of those stories. So I think that's kind of a constructive evolution. I think the destructive evolution is something a gentleman, maybe a couple gentlemen referred to earlier, which is like the sort of nihilistic, I don't believe any of this stuff. There's no such thing as there's no such thing as verifiable fact. I don't believe any fact coming from you. And I think that is a big change. I think we've seen probably more in the United States than in Canada. The retreat into non-factual bubbles that people believe are the only true factual bubbles, I think is destructive. And so there's a lot going on in terms of approaches to truth. I think some is great or at least good, and some is less good.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Guggengreen. I'm a student at UTM. I was wondering if you believe that media will be able to reestablish the importance of truth in the post-Trump era, or is the damage done today irreversible and will have lasting effects on media?
Another great question. Thank you for all these questions. They're really interesting. So I think about the Toronto experience, right, where people are like, we have Rob Ford, is the institution of the mayoralty forever changed? And then we get John Tory, who campaigned, if you remember, on a campaign of I'm inoffensive. I'm not gonna, I'm gonna behave well. He actually had a code of conduct that was I will show up for work. I will talk to the media. I was there, it was a 10-point, do you remember this 10-point list? Not to say he didn't have other, he had real policies, but a lot of his campaign was I'm gonna be a respectable, normal man. And I think you see that, with the Joe Biden campaign as well. It's kind of like a return to normalcy campaign. It's kind of we can do big, bold stuff later. For now, let's just have a sane guy. You're not gonna have to think about it too much. And so looking at the Toronto experience, I'm hesitant to say that there's gonna be permanent changes, because I think things can snap back to more normalcy pretty quickly. You did see with the Fords that the Ford brand didn't go away, and some of the policies didn't go away. So it's not like Trump would vanish if he was defeated. There would be a lot of legacies. But I think it is possible that if the election went a certain way, a lot of this could vanish pretty quickly.
Thank you.
My name's Verushka. Thank you for your insight. Do you give this talk to other journalists or have discussions about this subject, and what's their reaction?
So I've had, especially early in the Trump era, I would get in Twitter fights with other reporters. And so that was the way I was having these conversations. And I tried to avoid that more recently because fundamentally we're all on the same team. And I don't include Breitbart and OANN. And there's people who I do not think are on the truth team. There are people, but there are others who have different approaches who, I felt I shouldn't be fighting with them in public. But some people agree with my approach and wish that their bosses will let them do it more. Some people have incorporated more of my approach, and I wouldn't take personal credit. I don't know why they started doing it, if it's me or if it's their own shifting sentiment, but I think you have seen at least some change, people more aggressively calling out Trump's dishonesty, putting it on screen, cutting away from his dishonest speeches. But you have others who vehemently believe that this is not the right approach. I've been in Twitter fights with people from the New York Times who have told me it's our job in an interview to just help him reveal what's in his brain. The attitude is let's get him talking. It's not our job, people would say to me, it's not our job to play prosecutor, to cross-examine him. And my response has been I'm not asking you to be a prosecutor, just a little pushback. Like there's something in between no pushback and prosecutorial. Like journalists know this. This is what we've been doing for years. You know, you can be polite. You don't have to be a jerk, but you can challenge, you can prod, you can demand evidence and explanation. And so in terms of reaction, I'd say there's, it's been a mix from like, thank you for doing this, you know, you've shifted my perception, to like, well, I don't know, maybe I wish I could do this a little more, to like people who do not think I'm doing the right thing at all. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and being part of the 2019 Snider Lecture event. On behalf of the Snider Committee and the University of Toronto, Mississauga, I would really sincerely thank you for coming tonight. It was really enjoyable for me, I'm sure for everybody else. And on behalf of the university and the Snider Committee, I'd like a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for coming. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.